We are live. I am really excited to welcome Stace Caseria from Trust Deep Branding to join us today. We are going to have a conversation about the importance of branding as really the core of marketing strategy. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Stace and just ask you what's on your mind.
Hey, thank you, Jeff. Great to be here. Happy to be on the show. The thing that's on my mind is something that's always on my mind: loyalty. I'm always thinking about loyalty because I think that should be the grand ambition of all businesses. It's not about creating a marketing campaign or a pitch that gets a customer to buy something once, but we should be aiming for creating a system that ensures repeat sales. So sorry to be transactional, but that's what we do in the world of marketing. But the thing that I'm always focused on is loyalty. It's like, I don't want someone to buy something once. I want somebody to buy, like, see what we're doing through that campaign or whatever, see that once, and then continue to buy and tell their friends about us forever.
And I think, Stace, you said that's sort of transactional, but it's actually sort of transcends transactionality, right? You're basically saying, how do I create an experience so that people, when they do have a transaction with my brand, they feel that loyalty and they feel like it's worth, sort of coming back for more, right? I mean, that's sort of the, So no, I think that's.
I want to ask a question on this subject. And here is my thought. When it comes to loyalty, product attributes they are very important, right? And they play a great role. So how do you what levers do you pull, like in the loyalty? Where is the product role and where is the brand role when it comes to it?
I'm glad you asked that. So I tend to see, so there are businesses, and then not all businesses are brands in my mind. A lot of businesses are just commodities. So if we can interchange one product for another and they have the same attributes, that's a commodity. There's nothing intrinsic about that product that makes me choose it over another one. So not all businesses strive to be brands, but brand, in my mind, is the thing that has the power to create loyalty or get people to choose you, whether your product attributes are better than someone else's or not. It's that connection, like Jeff was saying, that in deeper level than product or service or those attributes. Like, in some way that business has found a way to touch me, connect with me, engage with me, and now they've risen to the level of brand rather than just a product on a shelf that has probably wonderful attributes, but no different than the attributes of a product sitting right next to it on the shelf.
Stace, do you see brand loyalty and sort of whatever the next step is, growing the connection of the consumer or the client to that brand? Are those just kind of, do you see them as two different things, like growing your utilization of the products and services of the company versus keeping somebody and building their relationship with them over time? And part of the reason I ask this is because, we're often talking about sort of how do you take one client and move them into the next category, move them into a bigger project, et cetera, in a services kind of world versus maybe a product kind of world where, Cheez-Its, I want Cheez-Its this week, I want Cheez-Its next week. I'm not looking for the next thing. Do you see those as two sides of the same coin, or there are two different activities?
I think they're dependent on a number of factors. Like, some of those variables you have in your control, like your product, you talk about Cheez-Its, but I think some things are outside of your control. But even putting that aside, I think the category definitely makes a difference. And so I think I don't think it's one or the other. I think it could be both. The thing about Cheez-It is that, which I happen to love.
I love Cheez-Its.
But
is that wrong?
So I think it depends. How much do you love them?
I will have to say, so Elena and I, both coming from a Nabisco background, there was a couple of years where I did not eat Cheez-Its out of loyalty, but Cheez Nips are not sorry, they were just not as good. I don't even know if they still exist. But
Jeff's brand loyalty just went out the window.
Yeah, there's something else going on there. But the ability for a brand to get me to try the next flavor, I think, is definitely easier if I'm a fan of that brand or one of their flavors. That definitely is easier. When we talk about a service, I don't know if you're talking about B2B services, Eric, but I think it's a little bit of a different game, but brand still makes a difference even in a B2B realm, because ultimately, whether we're business buyers, personal buyers, whatever we're doing as consumers, we're connecting with or buying from a person because we're people. We don't buy necessarily the service. We want the outcome. We want the outcome because it helps me live a better life, or make my boss happy, or we increase our sales, or whatever it is. I'm trying to get the outcome. I don't necessarily need that service or that product. I want the outcome because it affects me in some other way. So if the other services or products can affect me, then I think there's a way to move me along the continuum from one to the other.
I think in the world of business, it's just different levers, right? The brand, it's still, we're building a brand, but it's different components, because in the world of B2B, right, it would be the education component, the content component, the explanation component, the service level, et cetera, et cetera. But again, it all creates the Cheez-Its of B2B, so to speak, right?
Well, it's interesting you say that, Elena, because my career, I started out in consumer packaged goods, and I worked in grocery stores, and I worked in restaurants. It was really fascinating to make that move from a CPG world where you are very limited in the number of touch points because you don't have a direct relationship with the customer, right? You're basically, you talk to them in advertising. You might have I don't know, FSI in the newspaper or something, and then you have your your packaging in the store, but you're not there. And what was really interesting to move into the grocery world and into the restaurant world is it becomes super important to the brand, the operational aspects of how you're delivering your business, right? And so I used to say to my team, our job as marketers is to inspire our employees to deliver the experience that we promise to our guests. Because if you don't inspire the employees, it doesn't matter what you're saying. In fact, it's almost worse if you're saying one thing in your TV advertising and you're doing another thing in the restaurant or in the grocery store. So, to me, I think it just, I think you're absolutely right. It depends on the category, but for me, it was a lot more fun to be working in these categories where there are lots of touch points, which actually brings me to a question for you, Stace. I think when we talked originally, you and I talked maybe we said 5 weeks ago or so. And I think you were telling me about doing branding in sort of the biotech world. And I'm really fascinated by what is the role that brand plays in these categories where the consumer isn't even necessarily, they're not a consumer necessarily directly sort of interfacing with the brand. I don't know. It's always been sort of fascinating to me how that works. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. So that is something that I think about a lot, branding in the biospace, life science, med device world. And it doesn't apply exactly the same. And I think this is something we were talking about earlier. It doesn't apply necessarily the same in a consumer world. Something that is incredibly important, though, is consistency of message. So when I talk to people in the life science area, and they say things like, "Oh, so brand isn't as important here because we have a team of salespeople and they do all the work." And it's like, "Oh, cool." So
good luck with that.
What are they talking about? This goes back. I mean, it's not the same as your restaurant example, but it is sort of the same as your restaurant example. What are those salespeople communicating? Obviously, your product or your service, whatever it is, has some sort of functional benefit. But how are they describing that? So brand comes through in the communication, like all the actions of your employee. If you have employees that are customer facing, the brand comes to life in their actions through their, whether they're wiping a table down or making somebody's food or pitching a piece of science, whatever it is. Brand makes a difference there as long as people understand what they're trying to communicate. Because like salespeople can be awesome. I have nothing against salespeople. I just want them all on the same page, not like each with their individual script, but understanding that we have one mission as a company. This is our vision, and here's how we're bringing it to life for company A, B, C, and D. And it has to be consistent every time somebody talks to a member of that organization.
When you're talking about like therapeutically oriented biotech companies, like companies whose product that they're working towards is going to potentially not be on the market for 10, 12 years or something after they started working on it. What's the branding? How do you think about branding with those companies, or is that not a group that tends to seek you out, or how does that work?
What's interesting is that at that level, that company comes to us because they do want a brand, but they want a logo, or they need a website. So for them, and I don't want to like downplay that, because it is important. Those are important elements of your brand, those outward facing elements of your brand.
Yeah.
What I tried to say is the foundational elements are much more important. But you're right. There are times when they're just not there yet. They can't see that. They're working on a product.
I was going to say they're marketing, I guess, to potentially VCs, venture capital. They might be marketing.
They're not even marketing. They're pitching. So I don't even think they would even consider themselves as marketing something. Like, oh no, we're pitching this. We're out there looking for capital because we need to build a lab so we can make this thing.
Right.
But it's also probably awareness, right? In addition to the pitch, they have to drive general awareness of the company, of the founder, of the molecule, of what they're doing. So no matter what it is, it actually is the little pieces of building a brand, right? Even 10, 12 years out before the molecule itself becomes a therapy.
You don't want to start the day after your FDA approval and then try to start building your brand. Maybe too late.
No, but Elena, what you're saying is absolutely true. The difficulty is convincing people who are head down focused on this, whether they're either developing their product or whether they're out seeking capital. Marketing is something that I would say, and I'm not trying to use a blanket statement here, generally they don't have a great grasp of, because it's just not something that's in their wheelhouse, and they found themselves in this position. So not everybody arrives with the knowledge to say, this is something I need, let me go and pursue it. I mean, a lot of times there's hesitancy, like, this isn't something, we're not a CPG. We don't need this sort of, brand development, marketing thinking at this point. But if you could help me convince people, that'd be fantastic.
You convince them that they're really selling Cheez-Its.
No, but I'm curious. Wait a second. So I've got a group of people here in front of me. So like, I want to throw that question back to you. So how do you approach, a founder who's the main focus on his mind is raising capital? How do you convince him to, take a step back, think about branding? And I have an example of this I can share later if you'd like. But how would you do that? Like building on what you said, Elena.
Yeah. So actually, it's funny you asked that question, because this is actually that very question that you're talking about, I think, is the origin of where this podcast actually started, and the conversations that Eric and Elena and I were having, that we were like, oh, we should just, the world needs to see this. We're going to do this live. And what we talked about was this idea of that founders, we find tend to be like, we don't need marketing. Marketing is a luxury when you are a founder and you're like, the only thing I need to do is figure out how I'm going to either get my next investor, slug of investor money, or I'm going to get my next, sale or whatever. That's what they're focused on. And so we started to talk about this idea of enabling business development, as opposed to, so we don't do marketing, we do business development enablement. And the reason we started talking about that was because that's the problem that the founder is trying to solve. And so my thought in sort of that vein is, branding is valuable in whatever sense that it helps enable that business development, right? So if you need it because you need to have, like, we'll use your logo example or whatever as it for a second, is you have to have some form of branding and presence on the internet, because if you don't have a website, people literally are like, this is a fly by night, they're going to take my money and run and whatever. So you have to have that. And so in that sense, the brand is a little sort of acting like a little bit like the digital storefront or whatever. But that is a business development enablement issue, right? Like having a really crappy website, let's not use biotech for a second because that's sort of a slightly different story, but having a really crappy website that doesn't deliver on the brand really well or whatever, if I'm trying to sell people on projects that are like upwards of, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they look at my, you can sort of say, well, the website doesn't matter, but the reality is nobody spends $100,000 without going to your website. And if it's not there and it doesn't deliver some sense of, hey, at least at the level of this brand is real and not going to walk away with my money, they're not going to do work with you. So that's sort of my reaction. I'll throw it
I would just say, as far as branding and the websites and biotechs, that tends to be the one place they tend to put a fair amount of money. There's always these, I don't know if it works, but there's all these like fancy videos and all this like giant photos and stuff like that. So, but anyway, that's
I would just build on what Jeff was saying. Is I think the really true word here is be practical, right? Because the minute you say marketing, they think cost center, they think money, they think that somebody's going to spend my money. And here we say, no. This is a practical application. This is needed for you to get in front of the investors and the VCs. And as Jeff was saying, to get credibility and get, Google, whatever, stars, reviews, whatever it is, right? So practicality. And from that perspective, truly, we have been toying with not calling this workstream marketing whatsoever. It is, an enablement, strategic enablement and communication enablement of whatever tasks that you have in your, development stage.
Yeah, it also comes down to that alignment piece of, is your website aligned with what you're saying? And Jeff, I think you brought this up earlier, like, is it all aligned? And that's all part of, that's part of product and brand and sales. Like everything needs to kind of come together, or else I think you're going to make those VCs think, these people don't know what they're doing, or you're going to have trouble selling your product. Particularly, I'm thinking more in the contract research organization type space, because that's kind of my background. Is that's what you do need that in that space. And I think that a lot of people coming from the science in the biotech world are more used to that therapeutic space where it's not so obvious, to the founder.
This is good. And I like some of the things you're saying here. I'm going to come back and steal some of those phrases and include them in my next pitch. But I wanted to mention, so we were approached, and it's a different category. We were approached by a software startup, and they are a financial data marketplace. And it was somebody who got a referral to me, somebody who knew somebody who I knew, and he said, "Hey, my partner and I just left this one company. We're starting our own company, and we want to get it launched and then sell it as quickly as we can, sail off into the sunset. So we need a logo." And I was like, "Oh, okay, I'm sure you need a logo, but what else do you need?" He's like, "Oh, just a logo." And I'm like, "How about a website?" So Jeff, to what you're saying, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we need a website." I'm like, "Okay, but let's take a step back and try to understand what you guys are all about rather than just your product." And they were straight ahead all about their product. And I got them to understand that if they can develop themselves not just as a product, but a brand that stands for something, and they really did. They really had a unique point of view, and working with these two founders was fascinating. The way it turned out, though, was that we helped them develop the brand. We did light brand development for them. We helped them craft their story in their pitch deck, and obviously the website and the logo. But within 6 months, they were able to sell their business to BlackRock. And BlackRock is like the largest financial institution in the world. If not the largest, it's one of the largest. And I know that it was not the branding that did that, but I know that it contributed to that. And the founders said that to us. They said, we were taken seriously when we walked into these different meetings. Obviously, they know their stuff, but they were taken seriously because they had thingsomeness. They had something they could hold that looked real, that told a genuine story that like was backed up. Like, so when people said, "Oh, I see on your platform you're making decision A, B, and C. Why are you doing it?" They could say, because that's our core philosophy, is to make these three things happen. So that's why we've done that.
Right.
Those things make sense to people on the outside. Not all founders get that. So.
And
well,
certainly not software founders and not finance founders, because they sit very far away from all the soft stuff we're talking about. But when it comes to BlackRock looking at them with their functionality, and software is kind of like my world, you look at this functionality versus that functionality, and the difference are in line 27, right? And you have to really dig to find them. Then their story, their brand, their cohesiveness counts for a lot.
I also think that people don't understand, having gone through a lot of pitching in the last couple of years, that venture capitalists and people who are, angel investors, whatever, they are a different animal than the scientific founder, the engineering founder, or whatever. It's like they have, like, as you're saying, Stace, they just have very different sensibilities about what matters and what tells them where the business are. And, I think there's a tendency to focus on your product and on your nerdiness, whatever nerdiness that got you where you're going, but that's not necessarily the thing that drives that big picture. This is a big idea. This is the unicorn idea brand.
Right.
And I think that's right. I think, to me, and I think, Stace, this is probably what you're saying, is fundamentally the brand is the story. Like, we think about the brand as the logo or the name or the trademark or the whatever it is, but fundamentally the brand is the story. And are you telling so all the stuff that we're talking about, the consistency, the ability to speak to your values, all those things, like, if it's having a fundamental story of this is what this brand is about. And I believe, that's sort of always been sort of my take all the way back to my days, we went back to Nabisco and Oreo and whatever it is. Like, how do you tell a story about your brand that is compelling to whoever you're trying to sell whatever to, whether it's a VC or you're a nonprofit trying to get funding, or you're a nonprofit trying to get people to get volunteers, or you're a CPG. It doesn't matter what it is. Fundamentally, you are trying to tell a story, and your brand is that story. And the logo is just sort of the final, like, visual element that represents.
It's just the outward expression. It's an important one, but it's simply an outward expression of the story. So what I say to people is, your business is what you do, but your brand is how you tell people about it, or how you communicate what you do, or the value that you bring. So it kind of makes me upset when people say, I have a brand, I have a logo. I mean, they're not the same, but that's just, I'm sure if I talked to an auto mechanic and he said something that's like, oh, I have a car, there it is. And he would say, oh, like, he would understand that I don't understand about the car. It's the same. So I give people on the street, a pass when we're arguing about logos on the sidewalk, because that happens often. Something I wanted to mention earlier, or based on what you said earlier, Jeff, is about credibility. So people say, oh, we need a website because we need credibility, need to see that we're actually existing. And that's the idea of credibility is something that we focus on a lot, where, at our agency. And so I named it Trust Deep for a reason. I'm focused on trust because trust is the thing that gets us to loyalty.
Yeah.
And there are actually 4 components to trust. After 20 years of thinking about this, and I came up with a framework that I call the trust dynamic. There are 4 components: credibility, track record, empathy, and alignment of interests. And each of those factor differently in any situation. Sometimes credibility is much more important. Sometimes empathy is much more important. But all those factors have to be present in any situation where trust is involved. And we can't get to loyalty unless we first get people to trust. But I don't know. It's a fascinating topic. It's a whole. Maybe I can come back for
you
another
can
episode.
come back and talk about that. All right. So before we run out of time, I have neglected to ask ChatGPT. Always has a question. So let's see what ChatGPT. There's a couple of crazy ones here. I'm going to go with this one. I always ask it for 10, so I get some choices because some of them are super weird. But this was what's the weirdest request you've received from a client regarding their brand without spilling any confidentiality?
Yeah, that you can talk about. That's always the underlying.
If you can't, okay. I have other ChatGPT questions.
There's a restricting order of like, you can't talk about that.
Do you have another one?
Sure. Let's see. Well, so this one's a variation. You're gonna be like, really, Jeff? This is what's the most bizarre, unexpected branding success story you've come across? Is that even harder?
I have a different.
I think.
Yeah, go
Do
ahead.
you want to look, here's a gimme one, okay? If you had to describe your personal brand as a flavor of ice cream, what would it be and why?
It won't make sense to anyone. I'm just picking a flavor that I like. I think
right.
I'm gonna say it's vanilla.
Vanilla.
Sorry, what did you say?
Hey, Rocky Road would have told us something.
I said vanilla because I try to be transparent. And vanilla is, but then you say vanilla and people are like, oh, that's boring because there's so many other flavors. There's Rocky Road.
I have a non-chat GPT a little bit off the sort of topics we were on question, which is, let's say, and I don't know if you've ever done brand work for a podcast, but let's say there was a podcast called, I don't know, Twin Strategy or something like that. Like, how do you work with a podcast like ours or whatever? Like, how would you think? And I don't know if you've done this before, but how do you think about that? The branding that we're trying to build, for example, in this podcast.
Yeah. So we actually did brand development for a podcast. I don't know if you want me to mention the name or not. It doesn't matter. They're not a competitor, but yeah, it's called a Little Easier, and it's fascinating. But I mean, I don't want to go down that path, but it's called A Little Easier. But what I would say when I'm thinking about your brand, I would say, think of two planes. There's this thing that you have the authority and the ability to talk about honestly and completely. And then there's the thing your audiences need to hear at this moment. And you put those two together, and at the intersection, that should be your brand. You have to find what you can tell people that they actually need to hear or that they want to hear in that moment. So our lives are not static, whether it's our personal lives or business or whatever. So I think you need to continually, I don't want to say evolve as in change direction, but shift how you interview people, the questions, the people you bring on to address the things that are going on in the world around us. You have like a special ability with a podcast that other marketers wouldn't have with, like, if you're doing like like TV advertising or digital advertising or even writing content, where you're creating something in the moment and you can change it based on what happened this morning, or what's going to happen tomorrow, or the stock market did this. I mean, you've got an amazing ability there.
Stace, our challenge is we think everything we want to talk about, it should be relevant.
It's like what's interesting to us is our.
How could they not be interested, right?
Well, who's your audience? I mean, I know you three are. You really have to think about the thing you have that you can offer that can make sense to people, because Henry Ford building like a better car wouldn't have made a difference if people didn't need it, right? So what do people need to hear define that audience, right? And this, I'm not telling you anything like brilliant or very deep, but like define that audience and focus on like what you can say to them in this moment. I think that might be a path.
Well, Stace, this was a fantastic conversation. We are at a little over 30 minutes, and that's when we usually start our the sort of go around once around and give people a chance to say one thing. As I said earlier, you know, sort of like a hazing thing, we always make our guests go first. So we're gonna turn it over to you. What's one thing you want to leave the audience thinking about?
I think, we touched on it. I think each of us touched on this in a different way, but I think we share the idea, the overall idea that in any vertical or sector, the brand makes a difference. Brand matters, but maybe positioned in a different way. So whether it was business enablement, or whether it's this idea of finding your story, or being able to connect better with those VCs or whatever it is. I think brand matters everywhere, but not in the same way.
That's great.
Awesome. Elena, you want to go next?
Oh, I would definitely second what Stace was saying, and I would add, and it's never too early, because there are practical applications that can be used at every single stage.
Absolutely. Stace, before I jump in with my takeaway, what is the best way for people to connect with you, reach you, and with Trust Deep?
Yeah, well, I prefer human connection, so just stop by the house. Outside of that, though, you can find me on LinkedIn. My name is Stace Caseria, or you can find our website, trustdeepbranding.com. But LinkedIn, I post tons of content. You can find me on other platforms too, Stace Caseria. But that's the best way. Reach out, say hi, connect with me. I accept most connections unless you're a bot or offensive in some way.
Well, thank you, Stace. This has been terrific. I guess my takeaway, I'll sort of build on things that both of you just said, but this whole idea of the brand as a story, I think to me has always been just a super important idea. And I think it's fascinating that is true, whether you're a restaurant or a cookie or a biotech company, but it's fundamentally the brand is really it is the story that you stand for. And I will pass it to Eric to take us out here. So
I have two things that I want to bring up. One is, actually three, I guess, but you all took mine, which was the brand as a story is like, that's a really interesting, as the one non-marketing, non-branding person, that's a really great way to think about it. I also, Stace, really appreciated those different aspects, empathy, et cetera, that you were talking about in how do you present your brand and how do you pull those levers. The last thing I want to leave us with is I am really happy to hear that you are just as much of a Cheez-It fan as I am. Anyway, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to keeping in touch with you, Stace, and keeping the conversation going as the podcast continues. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.
Bye.